As the presidency and political career of Joe Biden recently came to an end, there are retrospectives galore on him. Since he was given the name Amtrak Joe years ago, and given that this is a channel called Rallying for Rail, I'll take this video to examine his record on Amtrak. I think that in particular, we should see whether his political work on Amtrak matches up with the nickname he has. So I should first explain how he ended up with the nickname Amtrak Joe. The origins of the nickname could be traced back to 2008, when CNN's Soledad O'Brien said, quote, "Coming up next, more on the Washington insider, who is also a proud Delaware outsider. They called him Amtrak Joe Biden. God, I have seen him on Amtrak a lot." End quote. And so, it was his frequent ridership on Amtrak that resulted in the nickname, courtesy of someone on CNN. But why did he ride Amtrak so frequently? He would commute between Washington, D.C. and his Delaware home every day by way of Amtrak, so he could be home with his sons. This was emotionally significant, given that he tragically lost his first wife and a daughter in a car crash in 1972. My theory with President Biden is that his significant personal experiences with Amtrak resulted in him being a fierce advocate for it politically, time and time again, in multiple roles, over the course of multiple decades. The first example I can find of his Amtrak advocacy was from 1981, when then-Senator Biden was the lone Senate Budget Committee vote against President Ronald Reagan's proposed cuts to Amtrak. Not only did he go against the opinions of Reagan on this, but by being the lone vote on the Budget Committee, he also went against what other Democrats on the committee thought. 1981 was not the only time Reagan targeted Amtrak, and 1981 was not the only time Biden helped rail against plans to cut Amtrak subsidies. In 1985, the Senate fought to preserve Amtrak's hundreds of millions in subsidies. The amendment came from Senator Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania, who at that point was a Republican. He would later become a Democrat, but how that happened is outside the purview of this video. But getting back to the purview of this video, among those who came to Amtrak's defense, yet again, was Senator Biden. In a debate about gutting these subsidies, he said that such a view on subsidies represented, quote, a creeping regionalism, end quote, that was, quote, destructive to the fabric of this nation, end quote. For all that I feel like I've made Reagan into something of a villain on my channel due to his targeting Amtrak, it was not just Republican presidents who tried to cut Amtrak subsidies, though. Under President Bill Clinton, several U.S. senators from the Northeast, Democrat and Republican, signed a letter accusing Clinton of trying to remove Amtrak subsidies. One of the people who signed the letter was Senator Biden. So if anyone thinks Biden is just some partisan hack on Amtrak, here is evidence to the contrary. He was willing to stand up to presidents who wanted to gut Amtrak, and it didn't matter whether the president had a D or an R next to their name. Biden was also a vocal critic of President George W. Bush's proposal to cut off Amtrak funding in 2005. Biden, along with the aforementioned Senator Specter, as well as Senator Rick Santorum of Pennsylvania, were vocal critics of President Bush's proposal. I once again remind people that Specter was a Republican at the time. And Santorum is a Republican too, showing, yet again, that Amtrak is not a partisan topic per se. You could argue that there may have been certain figures in the Senate who played a bigger legislative role when it came to Amtrak than Biden. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers and Trainmen, a labor union, suggested that Biden's fellow senator from Delaware at the time, Tom Carper, might have actually played a bigger legislative role in Amtrak than Biden. But that's because Carper was serving on the Senate's Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee at the time, something that couldn't be said about Biden at that point. However, the labor union did note that Biden was one of Amtrak's biggest supporters in the Senate. Biden was more than someone who rode Amtrak and fought against cuts to it, though. He was also an advocate to improve funding for Amtrak when he had the power to push for that. For example, In the economic stimulus plan in early 2009, it was then Vice President Biden who made the announcement that Amtrak was getting over $1 billion in funding in it. Still definitely a drop in the bucket compared to what Amtrak probably needs in order to have anything close to a world-class passenger rail system. But given that several presidential administrations, from both major political parties, have ranged between apathetic and antagonistic towards Amtrak, this was a huge step in the right direction. And then in 2011, it was Biden who announced an Obama administration plan to fund high-speed rail to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. As far as I can tell, that plan didn't go anywhere. But it's the ambition and aspiration that counts, I guess. And then the infrastructure bill Biden signed into law as president also provided $22 billion to Amtrak in a period of 5 years, as of 2022. I feel like, thus far, I have spoken glowingly of Biden when it comes to his record on Amtrak. But it doesn't mean that his record on this subject is without criticism. I really see two varieties of criticism. The first one is from those who think passenger rail is a waste of money. Such critics argue that Biden has advocated for throwing money at a money pit. I do not agree with that sentiment, but it is a sentiment that exists and is worth acknowledging. The other criticism I hear is from the other end of the transit belief spectrum, the belief that we should prioritize trains over cars. Some have argued that Biden's spending proposals are not enough in dollar amounts and not ambitious enough. Critics therefore argue that the Amtrak spending, while better than previously, is not enough to get America out of its car-addicting ways. I think there is some truth to this criticism, because for all the spending on Amtrak in the infrastructure bill, it is still far outpaced by highway spending. While the infrastructure bill spent tens of billions of dollars on Amtrak, it is spending hundreds of billions of dollars on highways. My counter-argument to this, however, is that a lot of the highway infrastructure spending is focused on repairing structurally deficient bridges. While I prefer prioritizing trains over cars, I also don't want highway bridges in such poor shape that we end up with bridge collapses. I don't think that supporting Amtrak and supporting the repairs of structurally deficient roadway bridges need to be mutually exclusive. To counter my counter-argument, though, while Biden's infrastructure bill spends tens of billions on Amtrak, it's probably going to take hundreds of billions, at least, for Amtrak to become anything close to a world-class network. Evidence of that is what we see with the Amtrak Connects Us proposal, which highlights what Amtrak would do with $75 billion over 15 years. That $75 billion, to be clear, would help expand Amtrak's network significantly, but it would still leave many decent-sized cities without any Amtrak service at all. Cities such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, Lexington, Kentucky, Lubbock, Texas, Shreveport, Louisiana, and many others. For scale, I cite abroad in Norwich, England, a city over 30,000 people less than Shreveport. And yet, Norwich is a major train hub that has 7 trains per hour, while Shreveport is home to as many unicorns as Amtrak trains in the Amtrak Connects Us plan that was outlined. My point is that while the tens of billions of dollars that Biden gave to Amtrak was great, it's not enough to make Amtrak what it should be. So where does this leave all of us when it comes to the Biden record on Amtrak? I think the good far outweighs the bad when it comes to Biden and Amtrak. It's not a perfect record, but it's a record better than any previous president when it comes to Amtrak, in my opinion, and a strong record in the Senate. Granted, some presidents were so harmful to Amtrak that the bar is practically on the floor. Nevertheless, between his policy record on Amtrak and his frequent writing of it, I think the nickname of Amtrak Joe is warranted. As a side tangent, I recognize that it may be a bad move for me and for my channel to say positive things about a now former president who, at the time of my writing this script, had an approval rating below 40%. On that note, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. Make sure also to leave a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you, and have a good day.